And could we have a roll call, please?
Director Penrose.
Here.
Director Lohman.
Here.
Director Clark.
Present.
Director Ruddock.
Here.
Director Slater-Carter.
I am present.
Chair, aye.
Yes, here.
Okay, we have a full forum.
And
And
could you introduce the rest of the staff who are here?
yes, rest of the staff, I have Tim Costello and George Evans from the accounts department. Tim Costello is from the operations and collections. And then myself, Kishan Patiwadi, I'm the general manager, and we have Jeremy Ungreis, he's our general counsel. And of course, we have public, a couple of them. Okay,
We have
Susie.
Don't forget Susie.
always forget her. I take it for granted she's here, sorry. Susie from the administrative side.
Oh, Debbie
It's
Ruddick.
taking minutes.
Deborah Ruddick, that is a great background.
Thank you. Yeah, it's Poplar Beach, but it's mirrored. So you're actually, it's actually south facing, but because it's mirrored, it looks like it's north facing.
The colors on it are amazing.
I know it was one day in February a couple of years ago. It was just perfect.
All right, so ready to get started first. Do we have public comment for any items that are not on the agenda? Seeing no interest in public comment, I will move on to the consent agenda, which is approving 2 sets of minutes and disbursements and the monthly revenue and expense report. Does anyone have any changes to that? Want to pull anything? Matthew.
We have to fix the April 12th minutes.
Okay,
They say that it lists 7 directors as present at the meeting. 3 from Half Moon Bay. And that can't be right. And then there were several votes that were recorded as
Oh, yeah. Sorry,
7.
we'll correct that. Yep.
Yes, votes that were recorded at 7-0 and no accounting for the 8th vote. So, yeah, that's got to be fixed.
all right, so why don't we pull that and bring it back when it's correct? So our consent agenda would be the April 26th meeting, and you all received modified minutes this afternoon, which I did some editing, and the disbursements and the revenue and expense report, correct? Does we have a motion for that, or does someone else want to pull something? Kishan.
I have a suggestion. If the change on the April 12th meeting is minor, we could do that and get it approved subject to those changes.
Does anyone have any objection to that?
That's fine.
Okay. Then
No objection.
we will add the minutes of April 12th, subject to minor revision. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Do we have any further discussion?
Can I ask a question about disbursements? There's a check to global diving outfall inspection for $12,875. My question is, when can we expect to see what the inspection revealed?
I actually have the inspection report, and we can bring it into the meeting, the second meeting of this month.
Yes,
Great. I take it was not bad. It was good.
we'll bring it back to the board.
They're
Yeah,
going
okay,
to edit
thank you.
it between now and then.
Any other comments or questions on this item? Then can we have a roll call on the motion, please?
Director Penrose? Director Penrose? Did I hear you say yes?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Director Lohman?
Yes.
Director Clark?
Aye.
Director Ruddock?
Yes.
Director Slater-Carter?
Approved.
Chair Dye?
Aye. All right, thank you. All set on that. Okay, moving on to regular business. We'll start with a presentation on the first flush report by San Mateo Resource Conservation District. And Noah.
Yes. Yep.
Kishan, can you give us an introduction to this?
Sure. It's actually, it was earlier called First Flush, and I believe right now it's being called as First Rain Program. So it's better known the coast side as First Rain Program.
That is a better name. That's totally a better name.
Yeah. So that's held in San Mateos, Santa Cruz, and Monterey counties. So each of these counties have watersheds that discharge to the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So every year, at the first instance of the rain, RCD and its volunteers together start with this program, and we typically bring back the results to the board during the month of March, April. So I would like to pass on the screen to Noah, who will be doing.
I have a quick question. Now, we support this. We help
sure.
pay for this, correct, Kishan?
Yes.
Because we think
Correct.
this is
We help pay
important
for
data
this.
for us to have and for the community to have. So we are subsidized. How much does it cost us?
Yes,
How much?
I think it's 20,000.
Okay, very good. I think
And-
it's important that we support this kind of investigation and
Yep.
keeping our water.
Sam
I think we've been
has-
supporting it for a couple of years.
Yes.
Sam has been donating lab space at the Princeton pump station, and it's more than a couple of years. I think we're going back, what, Rick, 10, 15 years?
A bunch of years. I didn't write it down, so I don't know.
Yeah, I don't, but I remember, well, Leonard Warren was on the board, and it came to us, and Sam was very excited and pleased to be able to start supporting this, and it was a long time ago. It was when it was it was an all volunteer effort, and it just made sense for Sam.
Yeah.
Thank you
Over
all
to
very much.
Noah.
Yes, over to Noah.
Thank you.
Yes, Noah, I think, yeah, you can go ahead and share your screen.
And could everyone see the presentation? Great.
Yes.
Very well, thank you all so much for having me. Happy to finally be here to present to you the results for the First Flush or First Rain program. I'm glad some of you like the new name. I'm afraid we might go back to the old name next year. We're still deciding on that, but First Flush, First Rain. We had 20 volunteers this year, went out and sampled 12 sites. We had a really great time out in the storm. And for those of you that don't know, I work for the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. We're a special district of the government, and what we do is we provide non-regulatory technical assistance to members of our district. And we were set up in the late 1930s to help farmers deal with the Dust Bowl. Now we work in 5 main program areas: wildlife, climate, agriculture, and fire and water. And I'm going to be talking to you about the water program and the water quality program today. So I sent you all a little report to kind of summarize our findings from this year. And in addition, this presentation is designed to be a kind of self-guided tour. So for those of you who want to go back and dig into the details and look at each of the sites that we sampled this year, that's available for you to do. And I'm going to just walk you through kind of a summary and then stop at a few key sites that highlight some interesting findings from this year. But here is a kind of interactive map of our 12 sites that go from Montera Creek in the north, excuse me, all the way down to Kelly Avenue in Half Moon Bay. And we had 20 volunteers, and we sampled the first big rain of the year on November 17th. So what is the first rain? What's the first flush all about? It's, again, the first big rain of the season, where freshwater runoff enters creeks and storm drains, and then goes out to the ocean. And it's characterized by high pollution. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why it's characterized by such high pollution in a little bit. But first, a big thank you to our partners and funders. Big thanks to Sam for continued funding and participation in this program. Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary organizes it from the top down for the whole 3 counties that take part in it. It's Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Mateo County. Big thank you to Surfrider Foundation, San Mateo County Harbor District, and County of San Mateo Public Health. And Kishan already mentioned this, but these 3 counties each have watersheds that discharge to the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary. And, you know, this really gives us, this program on one hand gives us this really nice long-term data set to look at on really mostly the same day every year what are the kinds of contaminants entering this important coastal habitat and what levels. And it allows us to get volunteers out there, get people interested in water quality and in their coastal environments. And it's a really great program. And it's completely volunteer-led, volunteer-run. So we rely solely on our volunteers who attend a training. This year it was on Zoom, obviously. And then they're sort of on call and waiting for the first big rain of the year when we get enough rain to wash contaminants off of roads and fields and other surfaces and into storm drains and out into the ocean. So why is the first rain or first flush so polluted? This is a schematic of a watershed. And for those of you that don't know what a watershed is, it is essentially an area of land that shares the same drainage. And the take-home message here is really just that what we do on land has water quality impacts downstream, even if those impacts are delayed until the first big rain of the year. So if you look at all these kind of discrete little drawings on here, see someone washing their car, they're washing down things like brake dust and detergents onto the ground, oil, that kind of thing. You see a trash can overflowing, there's trash on the ground. You see someone walking their dog, maybe they forget to pick up after them, it's leaving dog poop on the ground. And during the dry season, a lot of these contaminants really just sit there kind of building up. And then it's not until that first big rain of the year when a lot of these contaminants are washed off downstream into creeks, into storm drain systems, and out into the ocean, in this case, to the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And that's what we're interested in sampling with this program. So I'm going to show you some kind of high numbers of certain contaminants today, but I just want you to remember that this is, I like to think about it, it's the worst day of the year for water quality. It's when all those contaminants have been building up or washed down at the same time. So it gives us this long-term data set to understand how that worst case scenario is changing over time, and hopefully to direct some best management practices to make those bad days a little bit better. Yeah, Rick, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say, it looks to me like the problem was the invasive manatees.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the manatees are a big problem up here. I usually crack a little manatee joke on that slide, but I thought I'd skip it today. But anyway.
That's what I'm here for.
Include the jokes, Noah. Please include.
Okay, I'll try to throw some jokes in there for sure. So these are the pollutants that we tested for. That I'm going to talk about a little bit about today. We didn't test every single pollutant out there. That would just be impossible. And also, we have a good idea what we want to look for. And so these are the ones that we have our lab actually analyze for. And these are things like nutrients, nitrates, and orthophosphates. And these are things that can cause algal blooms, which can cause dissolved oxygen. So the oxygen in water to decrease, that could kill fish, for example. Also things, harmful algal blooms, which we don't see luckily too often on the coast side here, but those are a big problem elsewhere. We looked at heavy metals, so copper, lead, and zinc. Lead in water shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It's not something that you want to see a bunch of. And that can cause harmful impacts to marine organisms again. I'm not talking about heavy metals in drinking water, for example. I'm not going to talk about drinking water at all, actually, today. So those drinking water standards are a little bit stricter. These have kind of lower thresholds, but it's still things we don't want to see. And heavy metals can come from a range of sources, including cars. Things like when you tap your brakes, it can actually put brake dust onto the ground. Tires can leach heavy metals, and these things can also come from gutters and roofs, industrial waste, paint, fires. And then I'm not going to talk about total suspended solids too much today, but I am going to touch on fecal indicator bacteria, which is the kind of heavy hitter out here on the coast side. It's received a lot of attention, a lot of concern. A good amount of my work is focused on fecal indicator bacteria. And for those of you that aren't aware, fecal indicator bacteria themselves are not really a problem, but what they tell us where a problem might be. So fecal indicator bacteria give us an indicator of the presence of the feces of warm-blooded animals, which in turn indicate the potential presence of things like viruses or other pathogens that can make people sick. So that's a human health concern. And I'm sure you all saw the beach bum report from last summer. San Mateo County had a number of what they call beach bummers, so the kind of worst beaches for that summer dry period. So it's a big issue here on the coast side. And we compare each of the pollutants to water quality criterion. You might hear me say water quality objective, or to simplify it to say threshold or recommended level. These are just to say that there is an upper limit where we want to see these pollutants. And so being above those water quality criterion is the bad zone, and being within or below that number is the good zone. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but this is here if people are curious what the numbers are and where we got those numbers from. We'll be on this interactive presentation. So I'm just going to stop by 3 sites today because I don't have time to go through each one. But the first site I'm going to stop at is Montera Creek, which is the northernmost site in our sample area. And one cool thing about this program is it allows us to kind of zoom in and out and look at what some of the watershed area is, the catchment area is around the sample site. So here in Montera, you can see, right, we have a good amount of trees and we have, residential areas, but we don't see, too many big buildings or developments and that kind of thing. So kind of zooming in, provided an image of where our volunteers actually go out and collect water samples. And then kind of interesting data point here is nitrates, which is one of those nutrients I mentioned that can cause things like algal blooms. We didn't see those above recommended ranges. So that red dashed line is the upper level where we want to see these contaminants. And for nitrate, we only saw levels above that at Montera Creek. And looking back at data
from fertilizer?
It could be from fertilizer. Really not sure. Fertilizers are one source of nitrates. Other sources could be leaky septic systems. Could be somewhat related to pet waste, but unlikely. So lots of different sources where that can come from. But we haven't seen that much in the past. So the water quality objective is 2.25, so between the 2.5 and 2 on the y-axis. And you can see we really haven't seen nitrates above that level all too much going back to 2003. But we saw it once in 2019 and then again in 2020. And just to kind of compare how we fare to other counties in this program, we can see Santa Cruz has a good deal more instances where nitrates were above that recommended level. Again, that level is 2.25, so about halfway to the 5 mark here. And then Monterey, again, much higher still than San Mateo County. So while nitrates are not really an area of concern during the first flush on the coast of San Mateo County, it is a little bit more of a problem in some other places. And I'm going to stop by Vassar Avenue, which is one of the 4 sites we looked at this year that discharges to Pillar Point Harbor. And there's 2 sites I just want to bring your attention to, Vassar Avenue and West Point Avenue Ditch, which are just both here in Princeton. And I'm going to focus on Vassar here. Here's an image of where we actually collect the water samples out of this black corrugated pipe that drains Vassar Avenue. And interesting, this year we did see some of those heavy metals that I talked about, copper, lead, and zinc, above those recommended ranges. So we can see 2 sites here, Vassar Avenue and West Point Avenue Ditch, both in Princeton, both above that threshold. The other sites well below it. Lead, again, at Vassar Avenue, above that threshold, and a little bit second place is West Point Avenue Ditch. And zinc, again, just at that threshold at Vassar Avenue and close, but not quite, for West Point Avenue Ditch. So each of those 3 metals potentially a cause for concern this year in Princeton. And just going back over the records, so here are some of the sites that we've sampled pretty consistently since about 2010. And you can see that we don't get any samples of lead that are above that recommended level. There does appear to be a kind of increase the last few years at Vassar Avenue. You can't really draw a straight conclusion from this data because, each year is different and the amount of rain is different and all that, but it is something to consider going forward. And then again, to compare how we fared compared to the other counties in the program, the water quality objective or threshold is 30. So we find that here, it's at the top of the y-axis. We see no samples in San Mateo County where we had excess lead. That's really good going back. It's not something we see. It's good news we did see it this year, but that could have been a one-off, and it's just something to look for in the future. And then comparing it to Monterey, we can just see right off the bat, this number on the top left goes all the way up to 90. and there's a lot more instances where you get lead concentrations above that 30 mark. So hasn't historically been a problem in San Mateo County. There is one instance of it this year, maybe not quite as common as other counties in the program, but something to look for going forward. And then stop by one more site, if I have the time. Capistrano outfall, this is a big kind of problem area. It really kicked off a lot of the water quality work that we do at the RCD. And it's interesting, it's, this really small, it's relatively small watershed. There's not a ton of stuff in it, but this beach is often contaminated with that fecal indicator bacteria I mentioned. And just an image of where we collect water samples when it's flowing. You'll recognize this blue sign warning people that the water coming out of this pipe is contaminated with bacteria. And then, of course, these signs are all too familiar to us here on the coast side, warning people that recent water quality data suggests that the waters here are not safe for swimming or fishing or even playing around in the water. And, this summer I saw a lot of people, I think due to the shelter in place orders a little bit, people taking food out and looking for somewhere to sit and eat and sitting on the beach and, kids playing around with the sign right near them. So, it's an ongoing issue. And not a huge surprise, unfortunate, but not a huge surprise. This year, all of our sites exceeded water quality objectives for fecal indicator bacteria. And I just want to remind you that this is, the worst case scenario for water quality, the worst day of the year. So this is pretty expected. Obviously, it's not what we want to see, but it is what we see here in San Mateo County and in Monterey and Santa Cruz. And just as a comparison, going back to 2008, 2019, fecal indicator bacteria is way above water quality threshold, which is just about over 100 for this bacteria. But I want to just flag your attention to the number on the top left hand of the graph, 70,000. So obviously a lot higher than 104, which is the water quality objective we'd like to see. And there are many, many data points that are above that threshold. But when we compare it to Santa Cruz County, we see this number go up to 75,000, some higher numbers there. And then in Monterey, you see the number go up to 400,000. So the highest data points here about 340,000 and a lot of data points, around the 250,000 mark. And this is in no way to be dismissive, but of the issue that we have, work we have to do in San Mateo County, but just as a comparison to how we fare in the program. So just to wrap up, just a little summary of what we found. So fecal indicator bacteria, there's 2 species, E. coli and Enterococcus. Those were above recommended ranges in all sites in the first flush program. Not a huge surprise. Again, it's the worst day of the year for water quality, so we'd sort of expect to see that. Nitrate, which is one of those nutrients I mentioned, was good in all but one site. Zinc and lead were within recommended ranges in all but one site. Copper was within recommended ranges in all but 2 sites. That's both in Princeton. And then phosphorus, which is another one of those nutrients, which I didn't focus on today, was above recommended ranges in all but 1 site. And that actually is pretty common in the first flush, first rain program as well. So we appear to have phosphorus as an issue during the first rain, but nitrates are not. Just interesting, interesting data point. And then the what can you do slide. This bring you back to that watershed drawing I showed you earlier. Where the point there, as it is here, was that what we do on land has water quality impacts downstream. So these kind of obnoxious red circles with a dash through them are just highlighting, little things that we do that can have impacts on water quality in these small watersheds that we live and work in. So on the plus side, little things that we can do can also make big improvements. So simple things like picking up after your pets, making sure trash gets in the trash can, driving a little bit less to reduce things like brake dust getting on the road, not overwatering your lawn, that kind of thing can have big impacts. So these really simple things we can do, small acts, big impacts. And then we can do larger things on our own private properties, things that slow, spread, or sink stormwater. So kind of using the spongy aspects of soil or plants to sort of keep rainwater where it falls, and that can slow down the transport of contaminants during the first big rain of the year and beyond. And some of those examples are things like rain gardens, rain barrels, water bars in your driveway, or pervious pavers that essentially reconnect impervious surfaces like roads or driveways to the soil, which allow water to soak in and actually reduce some of the impacts. Big thanks to Sam for your continued involvement and support for this program. So we've been doing it in San Mateo County since 2003, which has been so many years of data and a lot of volunteers going out and having a lot of fun the first big rain of the year, and we look forward to continuing this partnership. Open up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Very interesting. We appreciate that all that the RCD does and are happy to support it. Do we have questions from members of the board?
I have questions.
Can we stop screen sharing so I can see if people have questions? Thank you. Matthew.
Hi, Noah, how comparable are the tested areas in the 3 counties? Here, it's a relatively small, sort of semi-urban, largely rural area. And I'm wondering what kind of areas in Santa Cruz and Monterey are tested. Is it the southern, Santa Cruz is the north end of Monterey Bay, Monterey, the city is at the south end. And of course, just north of the city of Monterey, there are several large former military installations that could have some real effects on what comes off this surface in rain.
Sure, it's a great question. To be completely honest with you, I'm not 100%. I don't know those sites very well. I know, sites in the city of Monterey, well, obviously, there's a higher, denser population, more buildings, and that kind of thing. So I would definitely imagine that would be very different to, sites like Montera or even San Vicente Creek, which are these relatively small watersheds here. But I'm not sure about those kind of military installations you mentioned. But I can look into. Let me ask Lisa at Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary about some of their sites, and I can shoot you an email and get you an answer on that.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have other questions?
Hey, I have a comment.
Okay. Oh,
On
Can
you hear me?
Go ahead,
On your overall map, Noah, it would be interesting if you could actually outline the different watersheds. There isn't enough topographic detail to be able to differentiate which sites are in which watershed.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a big difference. For instance, the Montera Creek site that you use is downstream from a ranch that grows things.
Mm-hmm.
So if they've suddenly switched their field practices, there might be that might be the reason for more nitrates.
Sure.
And enough of us here know the local activities that knowing which watershed some of these are in could be pretty useful. And it also, for instance, you were talking about the pipe by Barbara's Fish Trap there in the harbor. When this was brought up some years ago, Granada did an extensive investigation, and and both Sam and Granada have investigated that time after time, and it never comes up as a problem from the sewer pipes that they have found.
Mm-hmm.
So there's got to be something else. Now, maybe there's just a huge colony of coffee drinking raccoons. They're always up late at night. They must have coffee somewhere.
Those are the people I hang out with at night.
Yeah. And so it might help put a finger on or put some understanding into what's going on in these. For instance, there is a a cesspool just outside of 30 Cafe. And Kellex told us that there was no problem with that. Those of us who live here and have observed what has gone on at that place have been very concerned about that for decades. And we would see the pumping records from 30 Cafe, or not the records, but we would watch the septic pump trucks there more often than they should have been. And so, and Montera has asked the county to connect to our sewer system for at least 20 years. And the county refuses to do it because it will be expensive.
Yeah.
For the airport, exactly, for the 30. Well, there's also other toilet facilities in some of the hangars, I've been told. And I don't know where, they don't go into our system, into the Montera system either.
Interesting. Yeah, I really don't know much about facilities in that particular area.
Only those of us who are local and have been here for a while do.
Understood.
And frequent in 30.
Mm-hmm. Got it. I will look into that. I'm definitely curious to find out more. And I can at least add a map next year to show the watershed boundaries.
That would be
great.
useful.
I'm always curious about that because there are various reasons to have it.
Sure, I can
Kishan,
throw it in
you wanted to ask a question and then I have a question.
Okay, I just wanted to address a couple things Catherine said, just real quick. Just about the agriculture and nitrates. I didn't touch on this in this presentation, but I did we did that big water quality webinar a couple weeks ago. And I did talk about in the first flush data, looking at nitrates and orthophosphates. And although I would have guessed that we'd see the highest numbers in areas with lots of farming and lots of agriculture, that's not what we saw. And it was just it was a big surprise. And Kellex mentioned, I'll try to summarize the story. Years ago, we did water quality testing on some agricultural properties. And the field blank we used, which is just a quality control for our data, that had like 4 times the the allowable nitrates in it. And so she sent everyone back to retest the water. And we found the same result. And it turned out that it was actually the bottle of drinking water had much higher, what we would guess to be agricultural pollutants than agriculture in that particular instance. So I'll definitely throw in those watersheds, but I wouldn't be surprised if it illuminated, kind of disproved some of my theories instead of proving them.
Interesting.
Well, thank you. That's a good attitude is to always double and triple check because you never know where the pollution is coming from.
Absolutely.
I have a question, but Kishan, you had your hand up?
Yes, just out of curiosity, where do you get your samples tested? Do you get your samples tested, for the same location at different labs, or how do you work it out? I'm just trying to find out.
So for the first flush program, we send our bacteria samples to San Diego Public Health Lab, who donate their lab services for that. And then for all of the other parameters, so nitrates and orthophosphates and heavy metals, we send that to a lab in Monterey. But normally in my other programs, other projects, I send bacteria data to a lab in San Francisco called Cell Analytical. And this last year, I got the chance to go out with another organization and collect water samples and then send samples from the same location to 2 different labs to see what the spread of the data was, which I thought would be really interesting. And bacteria is incredibly variable, so you do get a lot of variation even in one single sample, but the 2 different labs they weren't miles off. So it was it was pretty decent quality control.
Okay.
Reassuring.
Thank you.
I got a chance to go and visit the Surfer Rider Lab and see what they do. Now, they are also doing regular testing at all these areas in the harbor. Do you in any way incorporate their data in what you're doing, or does it help you to inform your reports and your conclusions?
So there was a time when the RCD worked pretty closely with Surfrider and on collecting water samples. We hope to do that again in the future. But one thing, I do speak with members of Surfrider with Keith Mangold and Edo when I want to bounce some ideas off someone, and they're always really helpful. But Surfrider's Blue Water Task Force publishes their long-term data on their website, and that is something that I download and compare to look for long-term trends compared to the county's routine monitoring. So something I've been doing with San Vicente Creek is looking at the county has data going back to 1998, and Surfrider has data going back, I can't remember how far, but look at those and try to see what the long-term changes might be. But not in the first flush program. I haven't brought that data in.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? It seems,
A comment.
DTV seems to have a hand up. Who's DTV?
Dan, did you have a question?
Barbara, it's Dan Belleville. No, I did not have my hand, and I'm not sure how that happened, but my apologies if it popped up.
Okay, there's a hand up, at least from what I can see.
I think Matthew had a comment.
Oh, sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
No, unless it's been caught and fixed, the report, the report we got with our packet in the second paragraph of the intro says the samples were taken in November of this year.
Thank you. I'll fix that. Sure. I appreciate it. Yeah. In the future. We took them in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And at this point, do I dare ask this question? I think I will. None of the testing and so forth that you've done indicates that leaky sewer pipes are a major part of whatever problem there is, or you just don't address that.
So the way the first flush program is designed, it's really not designed to tell us where pollution is coming from. Just the fact that you get this big flush from way up in all the watersheds and there's lots of movement of contaminants from a bunch of different places, it just says this is what it looks like on the first rain. I do have other longer term monitoring programs that are designed for source identification to figure out where exactly that's coming from. One example is looking at sources of bacteria to Pillar Point Harbor, and the way that we've sort of split up and the way that we think about sources there is in terms of chronic versus intermittent sources. And we do not have data currently to suggest that things like leaky sewer laterals are a chronic source of pollution. There might be there's an SSO occasionally, or there might be the occasional issue, but it's certainly not, there's not like a big, broken pipe somewhere that we found that's, causing a big problem. Bacteria is just so variable, and there are so many sources that, I'd love to find the one big source and eliminate it, and we could all call it a day. I could retire young, but it's just, there are so many different sources, and it takes, one of the reasons why I kind of drive home what we can all do as individuals is that I really do believe that all of those small acts can have really big impacts on water quality, and it's a really diffuse issue. So yeah, to answer your question, no, I haven't found evidence of a big sewer leak, although there could be one that I don't know about. Can't rule it out.
Okay, you were good till at last, but we don't think so. Anyway,
I don't think so either.
Moving on. All right, so anything further on this agenda item? So let's move to the next item.
I believe there's a question from Michelle. She texted.
Michelle?
Yes, she texted saying, what about fish processing plant? What about the Romeo fertilizer plant? That's her question.
I have a very unsatisfying answer for you. I really don't know much about those facilities.
Okay.
But Michelle, let's talk. You always know a bunch. I'd love to find out more.
Sounds good.
Yes, she does. So good. All right. Anything further on this agenda item? Then let's move on to the next item, which is a presentation on San Mateo County multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan. And we welcome Ann Ludwig, who is the director of that program, who's going to make a presentation. Kishan, would you like to do a further introduction?
Yes. Before we get on to the presentation, I'd like to inform that the County Office of Emergency Services generally updates their multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan every 5 years. The last one was done in 2016, so the 2021 is now getting updated. And typically, the adoption of this plan helps the county and its partners to remain eligible for various types of pre and post-disaster community assistance, such as grants from FEMA, from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and state government. So this has been initiated by the County Office of Emergency Services. And just a background, Sam is always, Sam needs to partner with either of the member agencies, because we are neither special districts nor a city, and only city and special districts are eligible to annex to the hazard mitigation plan. But still there's a way that Sam can move forward, and as a stakeholder, we are allowed to given all the details to our partnering agencies, which we've already initiated. So I would like to introduce two persons who are here with us, and thank you all. Thanks to them for sparing the time to make the presentation. We have with us Dan Belleville, who's the Director of San Mateo County Office of Emergency Services. And we have Ann Ludwig, who's the Project Manager, Multi-Jurisdictional Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, County of San Mateo, Office of Emergency Services. So over to Dan.
Thank you, Kishan. Thank you, Barbara. It's Dan Belleville from the Office of Emergency Services. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes,
I feel a little bit like a fish out of water, because I work in the Office of Emergency Services and have actually been working in our Emergency Operations Center for 15 straight months. I've been there at work longer than I have at home, and here I've carved out a little section in the house. I think it's probably maybe the first or second meeting I've had in the house. So it feels odd, because I've been speaking to people in their homes for these past 15 months. So anyway, it's very nice to be with you this evening, along with Ann Ludwig. She's the project manager, as Kishan had mentioned, for the multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan. These are often referred to as the LHMP. They've been around for many, many years. And then, of course, it's a multi-jurisdictional because we have a lot of partner agencies involved with us this year. I wanted to thank Ann for being here with me. I certainly couldn't do it without her, but this is a massive, massive project on a very short timeline. But it's a very important project, and it does fall under my area of responsibility in the Office of Emergency Services. But I also just wanted to acknowledge a couple of other partners that are involved with us. We have members from the Office of Emergency Services, the County Manager's Office, Planning and Building. There's different departments. Public Works are all very involved in this project. So it touches dozens and actually hundreds and hundreds of people. We do have a consultant by the name of Tetra Tech who was with us during the last go around, and we've hired them again. They provide the consulting, guidance, and expertise as we submit the plan in the coming months. So we work along with Tetra Tech. There are steering committees. It's a cross section from people all over the county. Folks on the coast side are represented. We have Chief Cosgrave from CAL FIRE, Coastside Fire, that is part of our one of our core planning team meetings. We have Rita over as one of our community-based organizations at Puente. We have folks on the Bay side, the coast side, all kinds of people are part of this plan. So Ann and I are kind of representing them tonight, but we certainly couldn't do it without them. So without much further delay, I'm going to go ahead and walk us through a few of the slides, and then I'll have Ann pick it up, and then we're happy to answer questions at the end. The two key points on the mitigation planning are that it assesses the hazard vulnerabilities and identifies the mitigation actions that in essence will reduce the level of injury or property damage and quite frankly, the disruption that comes from it. And then the same time, and almost as important, if maybe not more, is that when we adopt our plan, it allows us to remain eligible for various types of either pre or post-disaster community assistance from FEMA. So if we have a disaster like we did with CZU, then we're eligible for some FEMA funding. And then as a result of putting this plan together, we may be eligible for some grants prior to the next fire so that we can address it that way. We do these plans every 5 years. And so the last time that we did one was in 2016. And as I mentioned, the main portion of this is that we structure ourselves around the FEMA process to assess hazards and the risks, and we have to identify them. So it's important that, that we put this plan together with all the interests that I mentioned above. We're also using, we're working with a number of different communities, as I had mentioned. So we're trying to partner with, like I mentioned, the CBOs in the county to build their interests into the plan. And I've already cited a couple of them, and I won't go further. But looking in this slide, you ask yourself, what is mitigation? Well, the definition is that it's sustained action to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to life and property. If you look at this cycle, this is really my world in the Office of Emergency Services or emergency preparedness. There's a cycle that includes prevention at the beginning, and then we prepare for whatever the emergency is, and there's a response to the emergency, and then the recovery effort. In this case, with mitigation, we throw that in the mix. We prepare ourselves for what the hazards are. We try to build systems in place, which I'll talk about in a moment, that will allow us to be better prepared before that emergency occurs, and then a disaster will strike. And quite frankly, they're happening more frequently than they ever have before. It's hard to catch up with them. And as I mentioned, in the first couple of moments, we've had our Emergency Operations Center open for 15 months, not just for COVID and for CZU, but for a number of other different emergencies, which I'll address in a moment. Next slide, please, Ann. So this time, as I mentioned, this is the MJ there, the multi-jurisdictional LHMP. For the first time ever in the county, we have all 20 cities and towns. And then when you add up the, there's two columns there, or, two little charts. One was the city and towns on the left, and then the special districts on the right. But we have all 20 cities and towns for the first time ever. And then, of course, the county of San Mateo, that makes us 21. And then we have 17 special districts now on the right-hand side there that brings our total to 38 partners. So it's a massive project, as I mentioned, with a lot of different interests. We welcome everyone because everyone's impacted by these disasters or potential disasters that might occur. So it's a big group, and I think by gathering all of their interests from coastside to bayside, we're going to have the most robust plan that we've ever had before. And I think we're, by including everyone, it's going to be as probably as thorough as one could possibly expect before we cross the line at the end of the calendar year. And then Ann's going to talk a little bit about the calendar events going forward. Next slide, please. So, I was looking at this, and I've been a first responder for 35 years. I've been in this business for 41 years now. And, I think if I look back in my career, I might take a look at some of these things and say, well, not very many of them happen, when quite the contrary, almost all of them have occurred on my watch. And this is not about Dan. This is about a true sense of what's occurring in our society. We're all experiencing climate change and what the impacts are of that. And then, of course, the ever ending concern about earthquake. We know it's underneath us. We've experienced them, but I experienced the '89 earthquake. Many of you probably did as well if you were living where you are now back then. I remember a landslide. I think it was in Pacifica where a family was buried under a mass land movement. And of course, we were worried about this year after the CZU fire. Because of the debris and what was burned off that essentially holds the earth, from sliding when there's rains. We're seeing more severe weather, high winds with these fires, higher winds than we've ever seen before. During the time that I was in the fire service, we would experience 60 to 70 mile an hour winds. Now they're approaching 100, which is unbelievable. Tsunami is an ever-present threat. We've seen a number of those over the years. Thankfully, they've not been significant. Terrorism, of course, when the towers first came down, cyber threats, the county's very concerned about cyber threats, and we deal with these risks several times a week. And so we have a team that deals with them. You look at the communications failure there on the human caused. In the last year and a half, we've had two major communication failures. Two lines have been cut that have cut out our fiber and 911 system at the 911 center that is directly above my office. down in Redwood City. So you wouldn't think that that happens, but it does. The radio network, we lost 5 towers during a day in January. In fact, on January 19th, just a few months ago, we were doing COVID testing and vaccinations at the same time with tens of thousands of people a week. We were in the middle of CZU fire recovery to try to get folks back into their homes or deal with their burned properties. And then, of course, we were concerned about the rains and debris flow, which we talked about a moment ago. We had that significantly high wind event which created some PSPS events. And then we had 5 new fires that were from the CZU fire that flared up between 5 and 40 acres. I'm sure you're familiar with those. We were evacuating a skilled nursing care facility, which are basically seniors that can't care for themselves in Burlingame because it lost power. We were in the middle of civil unrest and we lost 5 of our radio towers. So that was one day in January of this year, just a few months ago. So these things do happen. They are happening. They are happening more frequently. So we have to take them very seriously. Let's talk about some mitigation strategies. So it goes without saying, this is pretty self-explanatory. We want to seismically retrofit the buildings that we live in because we live in earthquake country. We want to create redundant water systems and fuel systems when possible. So for example, the building I'm in right now, we have redundant generated power, water, and fuel. So we can live in there for probably 15 to 20 days, depending on how much of the supply that we have is used, so that we are prepared for a major emergency that might go on 1 or 2 weeks or more. Tree planting is really big now in terms of reducing the heat in some of the urban core. And vegetation management is really high on the list in terms of some of the available funding through grants. And obviously the risk of having vegetation continue to grow out there is of great concern in this county, especially with climate change and these fast moving fires. We're also looking at community centers so that we can deal with PSPS events. In fact, right now, in the last 10 days, I helped the event center in San Mateo submit for a grant to provide air conditioning so that if we do get a PSPS event, it could become a cooling shelter for those that need relief from these sustained hot periods. And then longer term, we have to look at some of the policies for building codes and zoning, because much of what we're dealing with today in many parts of California are a result of not really paying particular attention to some of the building codes and the risk due to fire and the way the fires are behaving these days. Other benefits to the mitigation plans are we establish ourselves or we make ourselves eligible or more eligible for some of the grant funding. Obviously, it's much better to try to deal with some of these situations before they either completely fail or something causes a catastrophic failure. But it also improves our understanding of the risks that we face, and it reduces some of the negative impacts from the hazards to save lives and reduce displacement and some of the things that we saw, for example, in the CZU fire. It encourages sustainable actions. I think it brings to the forefront the attention of what's happening with our climate and how we might better build our communities into the future. And then obviously it's fostering collaboration, because we're here tonight, we're working with our cities and towns and many of the folks that we quite frankly haven't worked with in the past. So it's got benefits involved with it from the very core. There's other benefits that I won't talk too much about this. One of them is the community rating system, or the CRS. And this is essentially a national flood insurance program that reduces the costs for flood insurance. And the communities on the Bay side have experienced some reductions in their costs from having this program. So there's a number of different things that we can look at, whether it's on the coast side where the folks tonight are at, or on the Bay side in terms of how it might reduce costs or save us money in the long term. The next slide is, I talked a little bit about how quick our timeline is, and maybe I should let you talk about this one and pick up the next few slides so that we can answer some questions if they have them.
Sure. Yes, as Dan said, we are moving rapidly. We started this with a kickoff meeting on February 1st with our planning partners, and we've been developing the mitigation plans in phases. So phase 1, we started with. Our phase 2 is due in just 2 weeks. We then move very quickly into phase 3, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. What's involved in phase 3? And that assignment's due July 23rd, at which point we'll then be posting a draft of the plan in early August, beginning August 5th, and we'll have a public workshop on August 12th to review the draft. By the end of August, we'll be submitting this draft document to Cal OES and FEMA for their review and approval. This plan is voluminous. It has a volume 1, which covers the county as a whole, everyone under the umbrella of the multi-jurisdictional plan. And then the volume 2 has a chapter for each of our planning partners. So for your JPA, your JPA partners of Half Moon Bay, Grenada, and Montero will each have their own chapter in this plan. And as a part of that, Dan talked about the hazards that we've identified that will be assessed in the multi-jurisdictional plan. So we've identified the hazards. We've provided databases and maps and to our consultants who are now modeling those hazards. And they'll be developing a risk assessment, which gives us a hazard profile for our community. I've provided an example here. This is from the City of Oakland's draft plan, which is out for review right now. But what they do is they take the probability factor of a hazard occurring, and then they look at how many times this hazard has actually occurred, and they come up with a total, which is their probability times their impact. And this just tells you what a lot of us already know, but that things in the Bay Area, so in Oakland, for example, the highest risk that they have is of earthquake. And that's likely going to be a similar result for San Mateo County. We do expect that many of these hazards will rank similar to the way they ranked in 2016, although we are expecting flood to have a higher ranking this time, just because there's a lot more data available than there was in 2016. After we get the hazard assessment, then all of the people who are developing these annex plans, they take that information and they develop a list of mitigations. And the mitigations are supposed to be for actions of what we're going to do, as Dan showed you in the cycle, what we're going to do to prevent or minimize the impact of these hazards. And with the consultant's help, we'll do a benefit cost review. And then each of the partners will develop their implementation priorities, and they'll look at what the availability is for funding or grants to fund the mitigation action. And just quickly, there's a scale. It goes from a high priority, meaning it'll meet a lot of objectives, benefits exceed the costs. We've been able to identify a funding source, and it could be implemented in 1 to 5 years, down to a low priority, which isn't necessarily meaning that it's a low priority for the community, but it's just that this is a mitigation that, well, it does mitigate the risks. Maybe the benefits don't exceed the costs. Maybe they're difficult to quantify. Maybe we can't identify a funding source or grants, and they're much longer term. So they'll still appear on your mitigation action plan for your annex, but it's just an action that's going to take a little bit more time to develop. And then we'll do the same thing with funding priorities, looking at high priority and low priority. So higher priority means that it's got a better chance of being funded in a shorter period of time. Lower priority meaning there's still more work to be done to find funding in order to move that mitigation action forward. This, again, using Oakland as a sample of their mitigation prioritization. They look at any number of things. They're looking at a soft story apartment retrofit program. They want to continue their earthquake safe homes program. They're looking at a green stormwater infrastructure program. And then, you know, all the way down to the bottom, they're looking at developing integrated preparedness plans. And they want to look at implementation of these updates and coordinate them with the safety plan. And in the case of San Mateo County, we'll also be doing a general plan update. So we're looking to make sure that this mitigation plan continues to live on. And as Dan talked about, that when we look at land use planning, that we're taking into account what's going on here and ways that we can mitigate future risks. So that's just a preview of where we will be in for the next few months. I'm sure that your members will be talking about actions, mitigation actions, as a part of their effort to develop their plans. And we're very much encouraging, and I want to thank Keishan for his participation. We're very much encouraging that the planning partners coordinate amongst themselves as well as with the county so that we can collectively move these actions forward. Disasters and these kinds of impacts don't just stop at a city or a county boundary. So the more that we identify common mitigation actions and the more that we can pull together to implement them, the more successful we'll be.
Thank you very much. Kishan, did you want to say anything at this point before I take questions?
Yeah, I'm fine. I believe there are two participants who raised hand. One is Greg, another is Director Penrose.
All right, well, let's go to Director Penrose first, and then we'll go to Greg.
Yes, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Yes.
I am really impressed by how well organized you've become and are becoming. It's an all-inclusive program, and that's very exciting. What I did not see was a discussion for a mitigation strategy for communication redundancy. That's of particular concern to us here on the coast.
Yes.
Explain what you mean by that a little more.
What I mean by that is when Comcast goes out, you know, what do we do? Where's our second line? Where is our redundancy for communications?
Yes, we have received communications about exactly that. As Dan mentioned, we're particularly focused as part of the mitigation planning on ways to make sure that the lines of communications remain open during an emergency. But we do understand that there's also an interest above only in the case of emergency to just being able to communicate on a day-to-day basis. To the extent that the emergency will be able to be identified in the mitigation plan, I think we can collaborate on trying to make sure that the urgency of the matter, it moves forward.
Deborah, so it's good to see you again. You know, there's some things that we have control over, and then obviously there's things that we don't. And so if you take the example of the CZU fire, we were worried about debris flow after the first rains. And so it's hard to reach folks. So we employed the CERT folks to knock on the doors to reach people. We handed out some radios, some weather radios that have that pretty much can be heard anywhere throughout the county, no matter where you're at. You just have to move the antenna like we did with TVs many years ago. But it's a little harder to control, like the Comcasts of the world, as you know. So I actually had conversations with the PUC months ago. We have our alert system. We're going out to bid for a new vendor for our alert system. So things that we have control of, we certainly try to make them better than what they have. There's others that we can't get as much traction on. It's a challenge to deal with a lot of the coastside issues because of the topography and the location. But I just think that you should know that we are going to build some of these interests into the plan. We've already talked about them. We're very concerned about the fire radio plan for first responders so they can get out there and provide the help. So it's a challenge, but there's a lot of different elements, and we certainly don't lose sight of it.
Thank you.
Greg, would you like to speak?
So Deborah, thanks to you, because you're the one who actually got me started on this with a comment you made some time ago. And I want you to know that Ann and I have an open issues list that we added connectivity and emergency communications to it. And you probably saw an email I sent today to Comcast about this issue. To Dan's point, I think you have to factor in the loss of electricity, which we live without here all the time. So any solution that relies on electricity, just can't count on it. So I have a comment and two questions. Wildfire probability is going up. And so I don't know how FEMA is handling that, but I'd really like to study that in more detail, Ann, as we get a chance. Earthquake probability, of course, isn't changing. We have about $2 billion in home values in El Granada, exclusive of the land, just the structures. And of course, we have this huge wildfire risk around Quarry Park and the private lands that surround it. I saw the FEMA consultant mention that fuel reduction was a lower priority. So Dan, I'm really interested in your thoughts on how we can present revegetation, that is removal of eucalyptus permanently and replacement with whatever, okay, as a higher priority than fuel reduction, because that's the thing that we really need to do to make the fires controllable. Right now, we can't control a canopy fire. I mean, you can speak to that from your background, but we have a hope of controlling a ground fire. So just going forward, I would really like to hear how we present revegetation and removal of those eucalyptus as permanent and thus higher priority for FEMA. And then finally, we have a bunch of Caltrans properties on Highway 1 that are infested with eucalyptus, and we can't seem to find any way to get a hold of somebody there who can make things happen. We've talked to Denise Ania and some other folks. One of my MCC council members is also trying to get through to them. How can we get Caltrans off the dime and get them to file for their properties so that they're included in this? Because those, whether or not it's an earthquake or a fire, the blockage of our only evacuation route to me seems just as serious as the event itself. Thanks.
So Greg, I'll tackle that to the best of my knowledge. So as far as being in the fire service, I've seen some extreme shifts in my career. I've been around a long time seeing this. And when I was on the prevention side of things, I remember just, beating my head against the wall to try to get communities to work with us to help mitigate their own properties, for example, to clear the vegetation. And that in and of itself was a challenge for years and years and years and years. And the shift that I've seen now in recent years is everybody's, raising their hand. Okay, let's clear the vegetation. We're all on board now because we've seen how devastating these fires are. They're exponentially more devastating than they've ever been. A battalion chief got killed up in I think it was not the Tubbs fire. Anyway, up in Reading. And his car, was picked up in a tornado type situation and thrown around like a toy. And you couldn't even recognize the vehicle. The winds are unbelievable, over 100-mile-an-hour winds. And so these fires have really captured the attention of the public, and people are on board. Now, conversely, there's other areas of the county that are at equal risk than the ones you cited, Greg. And when it comes to changing, for example, some of the construction types and changing the building codes, people say, I don't want any part of it because they don't want to participate in the costs of it and some of those other things. So my point is I think you make a very good case as to getting these things cleared. They are a hazard, but we are competing with so many different interests. It's an extraordinary challenge. Some people want to keep the vegetation, some don't. There's cost involved. Who's going to take ownership? So it's an extraordinary challenge to try to deal with it. But I guess, the bottom line is we have captured people's attention. We do think FEMA is going to respond. The very purpose of putting this document together is to put ourselves in a position for grants to deal with these things because they're very costly, as you know. But it's been quite a shift, and I think the momentum is good. I don't know if we're ever going to be where you and I want to be, but we are certainly heading in that direction. I don't know if that answers it. It just sort of captures what I've seen, the sort of this pendulum swinging over the years. The second piece to your question is we did have a conversation actually today with State Fire and to reach out to Caltrans on some of the properties that you cited along the highways that they're responsible for. But the same thing, they have certain budgets, they have to get certain things done, things aren't well funded enough, but we are working down that path, maybe largely because of you and others, to try to get Caltrans off the dime to take care of some of their properties. So we were actually initiating some of those phone calls today, and that's part of what I do every day with Ann and others.
Well, let me know if we can help at the MCC. I know there are plenty of residents here who would dispute your comment in passing that other areas are an equal risk because they live here. But there are also people trying to establish that Caltrans is liable for failure to act, and that's going to be happening soon.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
I do.
Catherine, that sounded like Catherine.
Thank you.
There you are.
Yeah, these hand things are tough. Anyway, I just wanted to say, Dan, that Montero Water and Sanitary District has been trying to work with Caltrans for years to be able to take the right-of-way that's an island in Montero that's connected to no other Caltrans properties off their hands. And when you're talking to them, we would be happy to take it off their hands, but there's millions and millions worth of dollars worth of preventative work that needs to be done just to take care of the eucalyptus forest that has come up on it. And it's a strip of land that is very, very narrow. In some places, I think it's only 90 feet wide. And it's only a mile or so long, but it will require all kinds of work. We would be willing to work with the fire agencies and so on, but at this point, Caltrans has been viewing it as, and this is something you might run into, as a very developable piece of land that they could put lots of housing on. Chances of that happening are not high. If we weren't on TV, I'd give you a more descriptive answer, or a response, but it's not included in any of the build-out numbers, is what it boils down to. And they have done nothing with it for the last 50 years. So
Yeah.
it's a disaster waiting to happen on the edge of a a relatively dense urban area.
Yes. Ann, do you want to weigh in on some of your experience with Caltrans and what we strategized about today? Whether we get any traction on it, I don't know. But Ann, maybe you can share a little bit about what our strategy is today. Again, whether it works, we don't know.
Sure. Yes. Speaking with Cal Fire, one of the things that is significant about the Caltrans right-of-way in general is that that's part of our evacuation routes. So we are going to be working with them to look at evacuation routes and areas where there's primary routes and dangerous situations presented by the vegetation in the right-of-way. We're also, as Greg said,
right. But let me interject. This is not an evacuation route. This is attached to no other Caltrans property, and it dead ends on state parks, and it dead ends on Post. It is only accessible from residential streets in Montero. So it's a little bit different than when you're talking about on the edge going to the tunnel, or on the other side in Pacifico on the north end of the tunnel where you're going through this dense eucalyptus forest. That's also a terrifying and dangerous situation.
Yes. Yes. So in that situation that you mentioned with their property, that's another area I'll certainly look into that specific property, but that's an area where, as Greg briefly mentioned, we're going to look at notifying Caltrans of the fact that their property is considered a danger to the community. And a notification, and we did talk with CAL FIRE today, but a notification of that type, in my experience up in Alameda County, did result in actions, because if you can prove that they have been notified and something happens, their exemption from liability is not there. If something happened tomorrow and officially they had never been notified of this hazard, then under the state law, they're exempt from liability. So we're really trying to work that angle as well. How can we notify them officially of the fact that their properties are considered a hazard in our community?
And finding the right person to notify so it's officially received is then also an issue, I would imagine.
Well, what we did in Alameda County is the Oakland Fire Department sent the notification to the director, and in our case, PG&E sent their own notification. So in that case, we were working with PG&E and Oakland Fire.
I think this would be useful. We've had a whole lot of PG&E helicopter flights over the area checking on this kind of thing. And to be honest, PG&E went through this particular piece of property and did cut limbs.
Anyone else with a question? I have a question, which is, it seems as if the paperwork for this next phase is very significant, the requirements for the agencies. And I know at least our agency, Granada, we don't really have a project suitable for enrolling in this plan, but we are enrolled in a way in order to support potential SAM projects. So my question is, will you be providing feedback as to which projects, in your professional opinion, you guys who are in the midst of this, actually do have the potential to get funding, so that, you know, we don't have people spending a lot of time doing complicated analyses and providing lots of data on projects that don't seem likely to get funding? That's what I'm concerned about.
Well, the one thing I would encourage, our consultants, Tetra Tech, are very experienced in this grant world. And so what we're planning to do for the county's plan is we're starting to draft our mitigation actions now. It's one of the things we're encouraging even before we get the phase 3 assignment, so that we can set up some time, and the consultants are available to all of the partners. We can set up some time with the consultants and they can give us that kind of feedback. Their recommendations are to keep the actions relatively high level. You know, this isn't a project like you would do to get capital improvement funding. When you do the action, you want it to be rather broad so that you can target then the grant application in very specific ways, depending on what grant program is available. So they are a good resource, and I would definitely feel free to contact me. I can set up time with them. The partners are also encouraged to contact them directly if they'd prefer.
They did our last
Helpful.
plan.
Are you guys going to stay on in attendance while we have our next item, which is discussing potential SAM projects that we might want to propose for this plan?
Oh, I would be happy to stay on.
Great. Then let's move on, unless anyone else has a question, to the next item on the agenda. Anyone else? Oh, Matthew.
Yes. It sounds like most of the funding comes during or post-disaster. And I wonder, having all 20 towns and cities in the county and all those other organizations, towns and cities often run their own sanitation systems, and in your experience, have any of these participants received funding pre-disaster for wastewater collection and treatment systems? And if so, what sort of projects or mitigation plans got them some money?
Tim, I don't know of any, and you may. When I was working in San Mateo, I do recall that there was some funding for the sewer treatment plant that retrofitted certain portions of it, but I can't speak to it to the point where I would be accurate in my comments. But I'm not exposed to anything that I can draw from off the top of my head, other than I recall there was some funding for that. And you may have something more than I don't know.
I don't have anything specific, but I'd be happy to ask Tetra Tech. But the FEMA is putting more and more money into preventive measures. So these mitigations, there's a lot of funding for preventive enforcement or reinforcement of infrastructure, vegetation management in advance of a disaster. It's definitely, we've heard that the number for the next round of funding has gone up more than 3 times into like 1.2 or 3 billion. And before it was a couple $100 million.
We also think too that with the current administration and some of this infrastructure rebuilding, that there may be more available grant money than there ever has been before. We may be incorrect, but we also want to be ready for it as well with documentation and essentially shovel-ready projects. And so reaching out to all the different partners we think will be beneficial, and the timing might be right for this one more so than it ever has been.
Seems like it would be appropriate to move on to our next agenda item.
Yeah, before we go there, I must thank Dan and Anne for the wonderful presentation.
Yes,
and I must
thank
say,
you so much.
Yeah, and I must say right from February, I've been in touch with Anne, and Anne Ludwig is very resourceful, very helpful, and has always promptly answered to my emails and phones. I've been pestering her a lot, but she's responded very quickly. Thank you very much, Anne.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Keishan.
Yeah.
I'm going to step away. I get to work at around 4:45 each morning, and my wife, if I stay much longer, I'm going to let Anne do that so I can remain married. And I would like to thank you all for your time. And I couldn't do it without Anne. I think we're a pretty good team. And Anne, thank you so much. But I'm available too if you need anything, everyone. So thanks for the time tonight. And I'm going to sign off.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to agenda item C, discuss potential projects to be proposed for San Mateo County multi-jurisdictional local hazard mitigation plan.
Yep. Yeah. So all of us have been to the wonderful presentation presented by the County Office of Emergency Services. I also mentioned initially that SAM is not eligible to submit an annex plan as it is not an independent district. However, there is still an opportunity to participate as a stakeholder under another organization's plan. And that's what we intend doing. We have given all our information to all 3 agencies, City of Half Moon Bay, Granada, as well as Montero. The only difference is that as a stakeholder, one can participate in grant applications and grant funded projects, but cannot be the actual applicant. So SAM will need to partner with either one of these organizations or all of them. So the steps SAM is required to do is list of assets need to be included in the list by all the 3 agencies. SAM has already forwarded the list of assets to all the 3 agencies, and hopefully they would have included it in their application in the phase 1. And next step is the mitigations. When the organization begins to develop its own mitigations, SAM needs to be a part of identifying mitigations and include mitigations that address SAM in particular. So as Anne indicated, the first phase, which was due on March 19th, is all done. The phase 2 assignments are due by May 21st. And SAM, I believe, has provided a lot of information to all the 3 agencies and is waiting for any clarifications required from any of those agencies. Now, coming to the mitigations part of it, SAM has already identified certain potential projects, which could be a part of the proposed hazard mitigation plan. That is what is included in your packet, but I'll briefly touch upon the proposed projects. The first project proposed is a Princeton pump station replacement, where the estimated project cost is about $1.2 million. Now, this particular pump station is subject to liquefaction, very close to fault lines, and also close to tsunami regions. And it is more vulnerable and really.
Hey, let me take this picture to send to Erica.
Come again?
No, it was a, continue.
Okay, yeah. So that was the first of the projects which was proposed, which was the Princeton pump station replacement. Estimated cost is about $1.2 million. And the second project proposed is the cybersecurity. Our treatment plant operates on SCADA, which is a supervisory control and data acquisition system, which sends signals, which collects signals from all the pump stations and lift stations. It comes into the wastewater treatment plant, and the staff and the operators, in fact, are able to remotely log in to the SCADA and find out the status of it and make any changes or any alarms. All of those pop up through the SCADA onto the operators' cell phones or their laptops or desktops, and that is an important item. And therefore, we are very much concerned about the cybersecurity, because we've heard instances where people have hacked into the network and caused problems to the network. So that is our second project which we propose. The third is the wastewater treatment plant main power distribution center relocation to higher ground. We have the mechanical building 1, which is very vulnerable. It is actually, I believe the level there is close to about 15 feet above sea level, 15 above sea level, and more vulnerable. And if there's any sea level rise or tsunami or anything coming from the ocean, this would be the first building which would get flooded. And this houses very important electrical stuff. It houses the emergency generator. It houses all the electrical panels, the MCC, the circuit breakers, which is the heart of the plant, which operates all the pumps, motors, and various blowers and other important equipment in the treatment plant. So the estimated cost for doing this relocation could be either moving it to a higher ground or moving it to a different location is about $1 million. And the fourth one, which is proposed, is replacing the emergency generator at the treatment plant for any potential public safety power shutoff. And what we have is a pretty old emergency generator. I think the generator is about 700 kW motor generator, and this has been there since its inception, since the 90s. So it's more than 25 years old. We do. Was there a question?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, it goes into Ed's bathroom.
Okay, sorry. So this is one of the projects which is proposed for replacement of the emergency generator for potential public safety power shutoff events. So these are the 4 important potential projects for SAM, where these are actually make SAM more vulnerable to tsunami, flood zone, earthquakes, or any other sea level rise which might occur. So staff is here to answer any questions. I'm there, and I also noticed that one of my staff members, lead operator Gabriel Aguilar, is also there. So we are here to answer any questions.
Rick.
Well, since SAM can't do anything by itself, what's your suggested or our suggested plan? Do we split these projects up among the agencies? Does one agency take the lead? Do we all do them so they're in there 3 times? Do we have a plan for how to get these into the system through the 3 other agencies?
I do not know if this question was for Anne or if it was for me. But with Anne's help, I would like to answer this.
You. Just
Anne?
What's the best way to get all 4 projects into the system through us?
Yeah, I think the more frequently that the action is noted in a plan, from what we've been told, the more grant eligible it becomes. Now, each partner, Half Moon Bay, Montana, and Granada, might have to speak to something rather specific, but they can talk about the overall plan. So I'm not as familiar, but let's just say that the replacement of the emergency generator at the treatment plant was physically located in one jurisdiction. That group, if it was in Half Moon Bay, might state the treatment plant in Half Moon Bay. The other two plans might say that they're supporting it, but they tie it into how that furthers their emergency preparedness, their goals. So it might not be a cut and paste item, but having three plans reference the same item and talk about how it supports their plan's overall goals is very beneficial.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ann. I see that Greg had a question.
You know what's missing?
Yeah, I guess first I want to congratulate you. To use an old phrase, Kishan, you jumped on this like a duck on a June bug. So that's great. But what I would ask is, are we dreaming big enough here? I mean, with all the earthquake liquefaction and other risks we have with an intertie pipeline system that runs miles, what kind of earthquake damage? I mean, should we be considering distributed processing at some point, as well as elevation as a long-term solution? And the broader question is, does this dovetail with designs for reimagining SAM, which I know the board has considered talking about going back a few months? I'm just daring to think big here.
Well, I think with the short deadlines right now, it's going to be pretty hard to think much bigger. I really think the only rational thing at this point is to consider projects that of the type that Kishan has proposed here, because we're talking actually weeks and months. And I think while we can all say that dreaming big is great, there will be a further iteration of this. And at this point, I don't think any of the agencies have the staff time to really produce any kind of credible project that would achieve the kind of goals that you're proposing. I don't know what others think about that, but that's sort of my response to that. Let's propose some things that we know about and are manageable for now, especially given the incredibly short timelines of this whole process.
One suggestion, there are grants that are called BRIC grants that are for planning. So one, and I could send Kishan, I could send you some sample language. You can put in a mitigation that says, we want to develop a plan to address these things in the future. Those are fundable under some of the programs. So that would be an in-between. I think you're absolutely right. You want to have some short-term and things that are doable in the short term, but you also at some point have to do the long-term planning.
Yeah, and these are not that short-term of projects. They're just projects that we could describe, I guess, in the short term, and would take a while to design and plan and implement and so forth. I don't know, does anyone else have a comment on this? All right. Debbie, Director Ruddock.
Yeah, so as somebody who administers a state grant program, I think we need to be realistic here about what's possible. And I don't think what we have talked about so far is competitive in the bigger scheme of things. I don't think people are going to look favorably at projects that can be funded by ratepayers and that should be. paid for by ratepayers that are part of a normal capital improvements plan. So I wouldn't get my hopes up too high. I think the only project that might have a nexus to the program is the cybersecurity issue, right? But as for the other things like Portola Pump Station, that's in our capital improvement program to be paid for by ratepayers. So I just don't see it as competitive. Any of those projects is really competitive. And as for, I'm glad that Anne brought up BRIC, but so I'm aware of BRIC through my day job, and I just don't see our planning being competitive in that arena either. I mean, you have to look at who else is applying for these things, and there, take my word for it, many bigger, more urgent projects, both for planning and implementation, that this would be competing against. So I wouldn't get my hopes up. I'm glad staff took the initiative and, we're looking at it, but as somebody who provides grant funding, we don't normally fund things that cities and special districts are supposed to be doing themselves, right? It's the over and above or the unusual or closing the gap, things like that. So I'm a little bit jaundiced on this, but I just don't see it as any of those projects really competing well, with the possible exception of the cybersecurity. Sorry to be a wet blanket.
Yeah. So would it make sense to bring this back and take a look at what kind of staff time would be required to produce? I know the timelines are very short, but if we're going to really evaluate this, I think we would need to look at what kind of staff time would be required to document one of these projects to a level sufficient to enroll it in this program to be ready for funding. And maybe we could discuss, look at that, get a little more information on that part of the proposals before we, as a board, make a recommendation that perhaps the three agencies would join together in recommending one of these projects. I feel like we need more information before we go there. And I know, it's not like the SAM staff has a whole lot of spare staff time to work on this. And I think I agree with Director Ruddick that we have to be realistic about, what the chances are of getting funding. Now, you don't get funding unless your project's sitting there ready to be funded and, qualifies for the program. But spending a huge amount of staff time to do this also doesn't necessarily mean that we get funded. So do we have thoughts from other board members or some response to that from Anne?
I've got a response, and that is, I think going through this with staff, with the three agencies and SAM, we are at a point in time where we're looking at what we've been told is $60 million worth of work that needs to be done on the SAM plant just to get it up to modern standards. And I think looking at alternatives and Anne's mention of that BRIC program, I think if the three agencies and SAM are all committed to doing this, certainly applying for that BRIC program would be very useful, because as I've been saying on the distributed processing plant model, it allows not accommodation, but it takes into account all of the new or all of the environmental hazards that were not considered when the SAM plant was built, when it was planned and built in the 70s. They really didn't worry. They didn't even talk about sea level rise. That was when sewer plants were getting put based on gravity flow in the lowest part of the district. And in this case, it's the lowest part of the district in an estuary and on a creek next to the ocean. And then there's the earthquake faults. And then we've got a number of different problems that the SAM plant needs to take into account before we start spending that $60 million. And I think it's a good exercise for the agencies and to work with Anne on finding ways to do the most integrative hazard mitigation planning for a sewer plant and system that we can do. I hear what Debbie said, but we also have this opportunity to, instead of rebuilding what was designed 40, 50 years ago with old technology, we have the opportunity to really account for what we know can happen and to put it into practice. So I'd like to see us going ahead on this. I think it's important that each of the agencies be willing to commit some time and staff time and board time to getting this done.
Well,
there are always opportunities coming forward, and had we been doing this in the past, we might be ready to take it up now. We didn't, we aren't, but we can get ready.
all right, we have another agenda item that we need to discuss, and we're running up close to our 9 p.m.
Madam Chair,
deadline.
I'd like to just suggest a potential other avenue. I think our time is better spent talking to our state and our federal legislators about what monies might be available through, infrastructure stimulus on the federal level. The governor and the legislature have signaled that they're going to take an aggressive look at spending down some of the surplus, because some people in the state have been doing, pretty well to meet state priorities. I didn't see wastewater in there, but I think that I think that would be a more productive avenue. It's a chance to educate our representatives to our needs and identify, some of these projects with, programs that have a much clearer nexus, infrastructure, financing, sea level rise, adaptation, that sort of thing. I frankly, I can't imagine going to my council and saying, let's spend a lot of staff time, developing a brick proposal. I'm not seeing it, frankly. For Portola pump station, things that are already in the capital improvements program. But there may be these bigger sources of funding that could help with those things. And we need to work, I think, the legislative route. That to me holds more potential for productive engagement. So that would be my suggestion. Don't spend a whole lot of staff time chasing down stuff that, we're just not going to be very competitive with. But go see Jackie Spear, Kevin Mullen, and others, and talk about, our needs. We need to get a piece of the pie. It's a very big pie right now, both federally and at the state level. And, we should be hollering and screaming for a bite.
All right, well, we need to clearly develop a strategy, which is a combination of what we do with this plan. And I agree with legislative advocacy as well. Would people be willing to bring this back for further discussion at a later meeting? I don't think we're going to resolve this tonight. I think it's something we can talk about more, but I don't see that there's an action that we can take at this point to move us along.
Well, Chair Dye, there wasn't, it's not even, the staff recommendation is just to discuss anyway.
Right.
There was no requirement to approve.
I hate to just discuss, and I think thank you, I agree. But I think it's also important for us to think about, whether we're just dropping it or moving it along. Kishan, you had your hand up, and then Matthew.
Yeah, I believe this would be required, that the phase 3 deadline, which is in July. So the partnering agencies will be receiving their packets in June, for which they have to work in. So let's take a look at those packets once they are distributed. and then we can bring it back to the board and then discuss further.
Sounds good.
Acceptable to everyone. Matthew, did you want to speak to this?
Follow-up comment. Director Ruddick made numerous salient points there that I'd like to follow up on a little. First is at GCSD, we have 2 employees. We don't have the staff time.
Right.
This is a very complicated and laborious process to go through, and I just see how we can handle it. Secondly, from my experience, and I worked with much bigger organizations, wastewater organizations that were 20 times the size of these 3 member agencies, 50 times larger, Livermore Amador Valley Wastewater Management Agency, for example, and East Contra Costa County. They have 600,000 customers. And they had full-time grant writers that were employed. And some of the work that I did was on projects that had been grant funded. But one of the things that they would frankly admit and even throw their hands up about is you never get the first grant. This takes a lot of practice. You have to know what the buzzwords are, and you have to have somebody ready, able, and willing to stick on it as a full-time job. So the scale of our agencies, I just don't think allow this. So where do we go? I think, yeah.
All right, let's bring it back for further discussion.
Made some good points about legislators. Thank you.
Thank you. I think unless, we're going to extend the meeting, we need to move on to our next item. And I think, is there a consensus? Does anyone object to our bringing it back for further discussion at a later meeting? Okay. Thank you very much, Ann. Thank you for your help with all this.
Thank you, Ann.
And I think it's good that we're thinking about these items and that we're looking at what the options are for Sam and for the future. So I think it's been illuminating, if nothing else. So we will keep looking at this and discussing it further. So thank you very much. Moving on to item D, discuss proposed general budget for fiscal year 2021-22 and authorize the general manager to submit the general budget to member agencies for approval.
Okay. At the last board meeting on April 26th, we had a detailed discussion on the SAM general budget. We also had a presentation on the general budget. I'm not going to repeat the presentation, but the board could not reach agreement on sending the draft general budget to the member agencies for approval during that time. As an indication from Half Moon Bay that the capital infrastructure projects should be separately listed and voted as an infrastructure budget. Sorry. Subsequently, General Manager reached out to General Counsel and got direction, got an opinion, and the opinion is also attached in the packet. And therefore, there's no change in the staff report or the presentation, what was done last meeting. So they're here to answer any questions.
Does anyone have a question or a comment they'd like to make? Director Ruddick.
I think we made our point. Public agencies separate out their capital and their operating budgets, which we should be doing. I noted legal counsel's opinion that we should just keep doing what we've been doing. We take issue with that, but we also recognize that we have to have a budget, an operating budget for this year. So I think we made our point. It's still a goal of ours, and we'll leave it at that. And I'll make the motion to support staff recommendation to send the budget to the individual agencies.
I will second.
All right, any further discussion on the motion? All right, could we have a roll call, please?
Director Penrose?
Yes.
Director Lohman?
Yes.
Director Clark?
Aye.
Director Ruddick?
Aye.
Director Slater-Carter?
Absolutely.
Chair Dye?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right. Anything further on this item? Moving on to the general manager's report.
Yes, you will have a detailed report at the second meeting of the month. Just to give you a heads up, the wet weather storage expansion project is going on well. We're actually in the process where we are doing the backfill and compaction. It's almost done. It'll be done. It'll be completed in a day or two, and then we intend starting hydro seeding during the end of this week. And then, of course, attend to the punch list items, and then doing paving on the road, which was disturbed due to the manhole which was installed. So I've got a couple of pictures, but since we are almost close to the end, I don't want to bring it up right now, but I'll be happy to share it with all of you all. I'm already sending the pictures to you on a weekly basis, but further details will, along with the pictures, will be presented once the project is completed.
Thank you. It's nice to see such a successful project, and thank you again to Tim for all his updates on Nextdoor so the community knows what's going on. Anything further there? Attorney's report?
Yes, good evening, directors. I have a very brief attorney's report regarding vaccinations for employees, specifically COVID vaccinations. I was asked to talk about that briefly. The state of California has the DFEH, which administers employment policy, has opined that agencies and employers generally can require vaccinations for COVID, but there are some exceptions. So the main exceptions are employees can object on the basis of disability, which is can be a ambiguous term, and it's a bit of a legal. There are a lot of legal trapdoors in the area of disabilities. Also, employees are able to decline to obtain a vaccination on the basis of firmly held religious convictions. And finally, the requirement for vaccinations can't be applied in a discriminatory manner, which impacts protected categories such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, things like that. So it's an area that some agencies have gone at, but most of the agencies I've seen have generally strongly encouraged their employees to obtain vaccinations, but have not mandated it. And another reason to do that, particularly where you have unionized employees, is, and I asked Christopher this question, what his view was, that would it be a term of, if you were to require employees to obtain a vaccination, would be conditions of employment such that would require bargaining with the union, and his view is that it potentially would be. And so it wouldn't be an easy process, but if the board were so inclined, we could make a policy that Sam could have a policy to require vaccination. It would just have to be carefully constructed.
Kishan, do we need to do something like this?
No, not at this moment. We could probably discuss it further on.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Just Barbara, real quick, is it possible to do an informal poll of the employees? Maybe everybody's vaccinated. We don't need to do anything. Is it possible to do polls or just ask people?
Yes. I mean, you can't ask about disability status, but it is permissible.
Okay.
Moving on to director's reports. Anyone have a report? All right. Moving on to topics for further board consideration. Anything? All right. We still want to get resolved the Matthew, right? The aging report for El Granada. Was that funding that you're showing that we owe that our staff does not believe they owe?
Yep.
So,
We've completed the aging reports with Half Moon Bay as well as Montera. So those are all off. It's only GCSD that's just going back and forth, but we're working on it.
Okay. We will look forward to getting that resolved at some point soon.
Yep.
All right. Anything else? Shall we adjourn to closed session? We need a closed session tonight? Yes?
Just very briefly.
Okay, we are at 8:54. Do we want to make a motion to extend the meeting by 10 minutes?
I don't think we need it, but I'll defer to Kishan.
No, we don't need that long. We just need 2 minutes.
Okay, great. All right, so let us adjourn to closed session. Thank you, everyone from the public who attended.
Thank you very much.